On April 5th, 1911, 400,000 people lined the rain-drenched sidewalks of New York as an empty horse-drawn hearse crept from the dank, narrow streets of the Lower East Side toward the skyscrapers towering over Madison Square. New Yorkers from all walks of life had come to pay tribute to the unidentified victims of the Triangle Fire, the deadliest workplace accident in the city's history. A few weeks earlier, the workers had been forgotten cogs in America's immense industrial machine. Now, 1 in 10 New Yorkers were there to claim them as their own.
Public conscience thought they had failed these young women. They had somehow not protected them.
There was a recognition, wait, these girls can't die in vain. That was said over and over and over again, as if the city had somehow turned its back on them.
If there weren't massive funerals, it would have been very easy for the city and the city officials to say, well, this is it's sort of a natural disaster, it's a terrible thing, but there's nothing anyone can do about it.
If you ask the average American, is it okay for workers to work in a shop where the conditions are so dangerous that it could cost them their lives and not have government intervene? Most people would say no. There's a line. The Triangle Fire drew that line. It burned that line, really, into the nation's conscience.
Every morning, 6 days a week, more than 100,000 people poured out onto the streets of the Lower East Side, headed toward another day's work in the city's garment factories. Many were young women in their teens. Some were girls as young as 10. They were immigrants, Italians who had fled natural disaster, Jews who had escaped persecution in Russia, Ukraine, Poland. Their families had chosen America for its promise of a better future. But even the youngest daughters had come to understand that their precarious hold on the American dream depended on their willingness to work.
Father had to take me to the shop and not be late for his own work. I was eager to begin life on my own responsibility, but was also afraid. "Don't look so frightened," he said.
These young girls weren't just earning money for their own clothes or to, go out to a dance hall or to Coney Island. They were earning money to support the family.
Economic security was the American dream for many of them. Making enough money to be able to put food on the table, not worry about the making rent for the week.
As the throng disappeared into sweatshops and tenement apartments, several hundred workers veered off toward the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in the heart of Greenwich Village. At the base of the Ash Building, men and women stepped into wooden freight elevators to ascend to the Triangle Factory on the 8th and 9th floors. Workers like Michaela Marciano, who managed to send a few dollars to her family in Italy every month. Or Julia Rosen, whose 17-year-old son worked alongside her to help support 3 younger children. Or Catherine Maltese, whose 13-year-old daughter wasn't too young to join her on the factory floor.
Getting a job in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was a pretty desired position because they were working in a much more modern factory environment. High ceilings, big windows, compared to the coal stove heated, dusty hugely crowded sweatshop rooms. Triangle was a plum.
But even at the Triangle, sewing machine operators faced a 14-hour workday for $2 a day at most. And that was before bosses docked their pay for the needles, the thread, the electricity they used.
Sometimes you work at a big machine, and it's not working right. One of the needles skips, and you get blamed for mistakes. The same machines, the same surroundings, shirtwaists, and more shirtwaists.
On the 10th floor, the Triangle owners could feel their vast machine shuddering below. Max Blank and Isaac Harris had made Triangle $1 million a year behemoth, mass-producing the garment every modern woman must have, the shirtwaist. Harris and Blank were known as the Shirtwaist Kings, but their empire, as they saw it, was under constant siege. After 20 years, the shirtwaist was getting stale. Fashion editors began to showcase colorful dresses for the modern woman and turned up their noses at the bourgeois waist. No matter how much silk embroidery Harris added to their designs, the Triangle sales charts sloped down. Material and shipping costs seemed always to be rising. Profit margins matched this year's fashion, teasing the sheer.
For Max and Isaac, there was this constant awareness that they were, as successful and as rich as they were one bad season away from being broke. The competition was enormously fierce. 500 blouse makers on the island of Manhattan alone.
While they're getting the orders from the department stores, there's some small shop half a mile away that's willing to beat them by half. So it's all about continuous production to get as much cloth turned into a product as possible at the lowest possible price.
That summer, there was a growing new threat. All over the city, garment workers were agitating for shorter hours, better pay, safer shops, unions. Harris and Blank saw it in the papers every day and on the streets below. Workers were walking off the job by the tens, scores, hundreds. The partners even suspected talk of union on their own shop floor.
Unionization was the single largest fear for most of these employers. They were terrified that unions would come in because that would diminish their authority over the workplace.
The right to control their own factory was an article of faith for Harris and Blank, as for hundreds of business owners just like them. The Triangle partners were in a bracing daily battle for economic survival, and they meant to control all they could. Speed mattered more than ever at the Triangle. Volume kept Harris and Blank ahead of their competition. The men had invested in the most up-to-date technology, and it had to pay. The old pedal pump sewing machines made 34 stitches a minute. With the new electric machines, the girls were expected to make 3,000 stitches a minute, and no mistakes.
An individual worker would be assigned a task, whether it was, making collars or buttonholes, and that's what they would do.
They're subject to the rhythms of the machine. They are the slave of that machine and the pace at which it works.
Rubber heels had just come into use, and you rarely heard the foreman sneak up behind you, watching.
He wouldn't let you stop. Not for a drink, the bathroom, nothing.
Sometimes, in my haste, I'd get my finger caught and the needle goes right through. I bind the finger up with a piece of cotton and go on working.
Operators were charged for any mistakes that they made. For a lot of these young women whose families depended on their earnings, it was very, very stressful. They messed up a garment and their pay was docked. They would be left, coming home to tell mom, who always got the paycheck, families can be hungry this week.
Even after the machines powered down for the day, the Triangle workers were subject to one final management imperative. No one left the building before opening her bag to the foreman's inspection at the Green Street exit. Max Blank was kept awake nights, calculating the dollars he might lose if workers walked out with shirtwaists tucked in their bags, or fabric, or thread. To ensure that nobody slipped out uninspected, Blank ordered that the only other exit, at Washington Place, be kept locked.
Bosses are under such intense competitive pressure that they're prepared to ignore, under most circumstances, the grievances of their workers and to treat them like stucco, like animals, like pieces. And they don't fear anything. There's no government intervention. There's no labor legislation. And there's really very little sanitary legislation protecting the health and safety of workers. There are no minimum wage laws or maximum hour laws. Nobody's watching.
There was release at the end of a day's monotonous toil as the women stepped out into the long light of summer.
The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was in the middle of New York. If you walked half block, you were in Washington Square, Lower Fifth Avenue, the great Greek Revival homes of the affluent. If you walked to the other side, you were in Broadway, where Wanamaker's store was, where within a few blocks, what was called Ladies' Mile was, with all of the wonderful shops.
This is the Gilded Age. It's an age of extravagant, conspicuous consumption.
They can walk up Fifth Avenue and see limestone mansions as far as the eye can see. They can see all around them that there's all kinds of wealth.
They were so beautiful, those hats. They were so rich. The woman looked so dressed, in the back with the bustle. I wanted to grow up to wear earrings and hats and high heels. I liked music. I liked lectures. I wanted to learn things. I wanted to learn everything. The only thing is the time. I needed time. I used to creep up on the roof of the tenement and talk out my heart to the stars and the sky. Why were we crammed into the crowded darkness? Why are we wasting with want? Where is America?
On the morning of October 4th, 1909, Harris and Blank arrived at the Triangle to find their worst fear realized. Their own workers on strike. They saw this union movement as a personal attack on them, an attack on private property, an attack on the liberty at the heart of America's promise and possibility. Only 20 years earlier, Isaac Harris and Max Planck had themselves arrived in America, two young tailors from the shtetls of Eastern Europe, poor but ambitious. As far as they were concerned, they'd built the Triangle Waste Company with their own sweat and ingenuity. They'd risked every hard-won dollar on their dream, and the gamble had earned them each 10-room brownstones uptown, with maids, butlers, governesses.
This was the story that was being told all across Europe about what was possible in America. They'd made it. It was the American dream, the symbol of what it was all about.
They saw their wealth, their power, as perfectly legitimate reward for their exercise of individual freedom. And that was the best thing for American society. That was the best thing for the economy.
The evidence abounded in New York. Private wealth was building the city's skyscrapers, its parks, museums, libraries, and hospitals. And the men who made it happen were celebrated.
These industrial buccaneers are lionized. There is this commitment in American culture to an extreme kind of individualism, that individuals, especially the owners of private property, should not be interfered with. That to interfere with them is to place inhibiting obstacles in their path that will restrain prosperity and industrial growth.
I think a lot of industrialists saw themselves as fairly benevolent, as providing jobs, as providing the means of survival to hundreds and sometimes thousands of workers. And if workers complained about their wages, complained about their hours or the conditions under which they worked, they were biting the hand that fed them.
Progressive reformers have been shining a light on the growing inequalities in America for 20 years. The crushing poverty, cramped living spaces, and inhumane working conditions. But their calls for government to rebalance the relationship between employers and their employees went largely unheeded. What elected official wanted to put the brakes on the country's remarkable economic engine? Picketers at the Triangle knew that if they wanted their bosses to treat them fairly, they'd have to force the change themselves.
Winning a union in the shop means establishing a contractual relationship with the boss that covers all the workers in that shop with respect to not only the wages they work for and the hours that they work, but the conditions under which they work, and that their bosses no longer be allowed to get away with what they've been getting away with.
Max Planck and Isaac Harris weren't going to let a bunch of disgruntled factory girls tell them how to run their company. The Triangle owners used private detective agencies to provide replacement workers and muscle. Bought prostitutes to start fights with the women on the picket lines, and paid off the local police precinct. Their hired thugs beat Triangle strikers, and policemen hauled the picketers into court if they fought back. But every day for 6 weeks, in the face of physical abuse and public indifference, the women took up their places in front of the ash building. The longer the women of the Triangle stood fast, the more workers at other shirtwaist factories paid attention. Week after week, the feeling grew. Something could be done at their own shop.
I used to go in the ladies' room, and a few used to follow me.